So everybody is muted currently to reduce background noise. If you need to be unmuted, you press *2. Do that only if it's your turn to speak, please. Good morning. Welcome to the Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference on toxic chemicals in our homes, sources, health effects, and how you can support safer chemicals policy. My name is Patty Saunders, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information at akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. Our first two presenters will be referring to PowerPoint slides today. Everyone who signed up for the call by yesterday should have received a link to a PDF of those slides. You can also go to www.akaction.org and click on the announcement for today's call to bring you to the link to the presentations. Simply download the presentations and then click through to follow along. Our call today couldn't be more timely. There's been a lot in the news lately about the connection between toxic chemicals and our health, particularly those chemicals that are in our homes, garages, yards, and workplaces. We're really pleased that both Veena Singla and Sarah Dahl are able to join us and share their expertise with us this morning. Now it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce the first speaker. Dr. Veena Singla is a scientist with the Natural Resource Defense Council's Health and Environment Program. She works on creating healthier indoor and outdoor spaces by reducing and eliminating the use of toxic chemicals, especially those that pose hazards to vulnerable populations such as workers, pregnant women, and young children. Her current projects include research and policy initiatives on agricultural pesticides and chemicals of concern in consumer products. She leads work on groundbreaking policies which attempt to establish frameworks for safer chemical evaluation and substitution. Other areas of focus include indoor environmental quality and how exposure to multiple chemical affects health outcomes. Prior to coming to NRDC, she worked primarily on flame retardant chemicals as a senior scientist with the Green Science Policy Institute. Dr. Singla received her PhD in cell biology from the University of Alaska, San Francisco, and her BS in chemistry from University of California, Berkeley. Before I give you the go-ahead, Veena, I just want to remind everybody we have three speakers today. We'll hear from all three speakers. There will be time for questions at the end. So just jot them down, and I'll open up the lines at the end for questions. So welcome, Veena. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Patty, and I'm really delighted to be on the call today. So I'll start out and talk just a little bit about NRDC and my work. You really covered it in your introduction. And then I'll talk about flame retardant chemicals in our everyday products and why they really present some serious public health concerns. The next slide, please. So as Patty mentioned, I'm a staff scientist at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and NRDC is an international environmental nonprofit that employs scientists, lawyers, and policy experts to advocate for science-based policies that protect human health and the environment. And the work of the health program at NRDC touches on many different kinds of chemicals and industries, including mercury, the global supply chain, energy development, sustainable food systems, and what I'm going to talk about today, chemicals in our everyday products and chemical policy. Next slide, please. Flame retardants are exactly the kinds of chemicals that I'm most concerned about as presenting risks to vulnerable populations, specifically workers, pregnant women, and young children. So I'll start out talking about some of the basics of flame retardant chemicals and discuss current research on the health and environmental impacts, and finally end with some good news about why we don't need these toxic chemicals for fire safety in our everyday products after all. Next slide. So what are these flame retardant chemicals? Well, as their name suggests, they're chemicals that are added to products to meet flammability standards with the goal of preventing and slowing fires. Now, many of these flammability standards for products were established decades ago in the 70s with very good intentions, but what people didn't really consider at that time is the health and environmental impacts of the chemicals that are used to meet these standards, these flame retardant chemicals. And we now know that many of these chemicals are associated with significant concerns, and that the flame retardant chemicals aren't even effective for the intended purpose in many cases. Next slide. Now, an example of one of these flammability standards that was established decades ago is called Technical Bulletin 117, or TB 117. And it was established in California in 1975 for upholstered furniture and some juvenile or baby products like strollers, infant carriers, high chairs, and playpens. And what this standard says is that the filling inside the product must resist a small open flame. And the most common filling inside are couches and armchairs and baby products is polyurethane foam. And flame retardants are added to the foam inside these products to pass this TB 117 test. Next slide. So here I am looking for the TB 117 label underneath my couch, and you can see what the label looks like there. And even though this TB 117 is a California standard, since 1975, it's become followed across the U.S. and North America because manufacturers didn't really want to make two different products, one for California and one for the rest of the U.S. So what this means is that when you go home tonight, you can look underneath your couch or sofa and try to find this tag, and if you find it, that means your couch most likely contains flame retardants too. So I said the flame retardants are added to the foam inside the furniture. So if they're inside the furniture, why are we so concerned about them? Next slide. To understand and track the effects of the flame retardant chemicals, we really need to understand each step in the pathway. So where the flame retardants are coming from, how the chemicals get into people's bodies, that's known as the exposure pathways, what levels of exposure people have, and finally if there's adverse health associations found in studies. And toxicology can help us understand the biological mechanisms by which these chemicals can cause adverse health effects. So let's start by looking at the environmental sources. Next slide. The most well-studied flame retardants are called PBDEs, which is short for polybrominated diphenyl ethers, quite a mouthful. And these PBDEs were added to the foam inside furniture and baby products, to the plastic cases around electronics like our computers and monitors and televisions, and also to textiles. So PBDEs started being widely used in all these products in the 70s, and then scientists noticed something very alarming. Next slide. It looked like the PBDE flame retardants were getting into people. So what we're looking at here is a graph from human biomonitoring studies conducted by the Centers for Disease Control. On the bottom of the graph is the year that the blood samples were collected, and then what we're looking at is the concentration or amount of PBDEs in people's serum. And what you can see that the trend over time is that the levels of PBDEs are rising in people's bodies. And furthermore, these studies are finding very widespread exposure. So in 2004, almost every single sample tested contained PBDEs, and PBDEs were found in human blood, breast milk, and fat tissue. So the levels are rising over time, and we're seeing widespread exposure. Next slide. But then how are these flame retardants getting into people so widely? Next slide. Well, it turns out that the flame retardants don't stay in the products that they're put into. They're not bounded or bonded to the plastic materials, and they're what's called semi-volatile organic chemicals. So they continuously off-gas from the foam inside the couch or the case of a TV or computer monitor. You may be familiar with volatile organic chemicals, or VOCs, like paint thinner or nail polish remover. You know, when you take the lid off of one of those products, you can smell that really strong chemical smell. That's the chemical off-gassing. Now, these semi-volatile organic chemicals, like these flame retardants, they're doing the same thing. They're just doing it much more slowly as they migrate out of the products and attach to particles in the air. And then these contaminated particles settle out into our indoor dust, our house dust. Next slide. And it's this flame retardant contaminated air and dust that's the main way that these chemicals enter our bodies. So we can breathe in the contaminated air and dust, touch the dust, and accidentally get the dust in our mouths when we're eating. So everyone can be exposed to these flame retardant chemicals in the home, but not everyone has the same level of exposure to flame retardant chemicals. Next slide. In fact, it's young children that are really vulnerable to flame retardant exposures. On average, young children have about 3 times greater levels of PBDEs in their bodies compared to their moms. So here we're looking at moms and their 1.5 to 4-year-old children and the amount of PBDEs found in their blood. So young kids have much greater contact with contaminated dust because they crawl and play on the floor and constantly put their hands in their mouths and toys and objects in their mouths. So this is really a concern because PBDEs have developmental effects to which children are more vulnerable. Next slide. In studies conducted in lab animals like mice, PBDEs are found to disrupt the body's normal hormones and cause significant negative effects on normal brain development and normal reproductive system development. So this can affect fertility and immune function and also cause cancer. Next slide. And now that so many people have been exposed for so long to PBDEs, unfortunately, we're seeing similar health effects in people, sadly enough. What we see is that women with higher levels of PBDEs is associated with taking a longer time to get pregnant and altered levels of thyroid hormones. When mom has higher levels of PBDEs when she's pregnant, that's associated with negative outcomes in the kids. So lower birth weight, attention problems, coordination problems, as well as lowered IQ points. PBDE levels in men are also associated with hormonal changes as well as decreased sperm quality and testis size. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the neurodevelopmental problems caused by lead exposures. I know it's certainly been on my mind with how much flint has been in the news. And the IQ deficits associated with PBDEs are similar, and they've actually become known as the new lead. Next slide. So here what we're looking at is changes in IQ score found in different studies that looked at prenatal exposures to PBDEs or lead. In the blue bars, you can see the average change in IQ score with the PBDE studies, and the gray bars show the average changes in the lead studies. You can see that there can be similar loss of IQ with these early life exposures to PBDEs. Next slide. So we've now traced the path of flame retardants from products to people. What I told you is that flame retardants are common in our everyday products, and that they continuously migrate out of products and into our indoor environments and dust. Human exposure is ubiquitous, and studies show associations with adverse health effects, particularly for early life exposures and developmental effects in kids. And toxicology in animal studies suggest that it's disruption of thyroid hormonal pathways that may be behind many of these health effects. So this is all pretty bad news. Next slide. But the good news is it took some time, but PBDEs have finally been banned or phased out of use. And concerns about human health effects were certainly a primary factor driving these decisions, but PBDEs also have some other unwanted properties, persistence and bioaccumulation, as well as being toxic. And this gives them the distinction of being what's called persistent organic pollutants. So persistent means that they don't break down in the environment to safer substances, and bioaccumulative means that the chemicals tend to build up in the fatty tissues of animals, and they become more and more concentrated as you move up the food chain. And these types of chemicals are considered unmanageable risks because they tend to spread across the entire planet. And even though a majority of PBDEs were used almost exclusively in North America, they're now global contaminants. They're found from the Arctic to the Antarctic in animals as far-flung as Tasmanian devils in Australia and octopus in the deep ocean. So these persistent organic pollutants are really hard to manage. You can't manage them because even once you decide not to use or make them anymore, what's in the environment will stay there, and we can't really control where it goes. So we're still dealing with the legacy of persistent organic pollutants like the pesticide DDT and PCBs, which were also used as flame retardants, and this is decades after they've stopped being used. The next slide. So PBDEs were bad news and good riddance to them, but have they been replaced with safer flame retardants? Next slide. Now, I've told you about the PBDEs used in furniture and baby products and electronics, and they were all banned and phased out. And PBDEs were replaced with another flame retardant called chlorinated tris. And in 2013, chlorinated tris was listed as causing cancer by the state of California, and it was phased out of use for furniture and baby products. A popular replacement was this mix called Firemaster 550, and it's a mixture of 4 different flame retardants. Initial studies show that it causes obesity and anxiety in animal studies. That is exactly what we do not need more of. So here we're seeing the problem of what's known as the regrettable substitution or the toxic whack-a-mole. When one harmful chemical is banned or phased out, it's replaced by another similar chemical that's also toxic. Next slide. And we're seeing the same patterns with the replacement flame retardants as we did with the PBDEs. So what we're looking at here in these graphs this graph is evidence of exposure to 2 different replacement flame retardants. And the light blue bars shows the level in moms, and the dark blue bar shows the level in young kids, 1 to 5 year olds. And we see the same pattern where young children have significantly higher exposures, from 3 to 5 times higher, of these replacement flame retardants. Next slide. And for the replacement flame retardants, again, we're finding that this contaminated dust is a significant contributor to how these flame retardants are getting into the kids' bodies, and also that baby products with flame retardants in the foam are associated with higher flame retardant exposures in kids. So infants and toddlers spending large amounts of time in close contact with these products may breathe in or absorb higher levels of these chemicals. So this story may be starting to sound familiar. And next slide. Like the PBDEs, many replacement flame retardants are now global contaminants, and they've been spreading around the planet on high atmospheric currents. So replacement flame retardants have also been detected in Arctic air and animals. I wanted to mention that Alaskans are vulnerable to flame retardant chemicals, both because of greater time spent indoors in cold weather, and because these types of chemicals can deposit and build up in the Arctic at greater levels. If you haven't read this excellent book called Silent Snow, I highly recommend it. It tells a story of how Inuit people that were living a traditional lifestyle far from any industrialization were found to have some of the highest levels of industrial chemicals in their bodies because of these global transport pathways. The next slide. So what can we do then about the problem of toxic flame retardants when we're just seeing these regrettable substitutions? Well, what about the flammability standards that are driving all the flame retardant use in furniture and baby products in the first place? Let's look at that. Next slide. So if you remember, that standard is called TD 117, and we know now that it's not a good standard from a public health standpoint because of these flame retardant chemicals. But is it a good standard from a fire safety perspective? Next slide. Well, it turns out it's not. So if you think about if you drop a cigarette or a match on a couch or a sofa, what would catch on fire first? Well, it's the fabric, right, the cover or fabric of the couch. And studies found that the cover will catch on fire whether or not there are flame retardants in the filling. And once it starts burning, you have a larger flame that overwhelms the flame retardants in the foam. So studies at the Consumer Product Safety Commission found no practically significant difference between the fire performance of furniture with or without flame retardants. So these flame retardants in furniture filling and baby products have been called the worst of both worlds by fire safety experts because they're not providing a fire safety benefit, but they pose a threat to public health. Next slide. The flame retardant industry has lobbied intensively in states to block new laws that would restrict flame retardant chemicals, and the industry has made false and deceptive claims about the safety of flame retardant chemicals and the fire safety benefits that they provide. If you're interested in learning more about this, I recommend these 3 excellent pieces of investigative journalism which tells more of the story of the deceptive industry tactics. The Chicago Tribune series is available online, and Toxic Hot Seat is available to stream on HBO Go. I'm in the background for about 10 seconds in one of the scenes, so that's my 15 seconds of fame. And Merchants of Doubt is streaming on Netflix. So I'll end with more good news that states have been able to win some big victories in the past few years to change standards and get toxic flame retardants out of everyday products so that we can all be healthier. And I think Sarah will talk more about that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Our next presenter is Sarah Dahl, who is the National Director for Safer States, a campaign composed of state-based organizations whose champion policy and market solutions to protect public health and communities from toxic chemicals. She is also the Healthy Babies Bright Futures Bright Choices Program Director and currently manages more than 26 partners engaged in a coordinated campaign to eliminate the unnecessary use of toxic flame retardants. Before joining Safer States, Sarah was the Environmental Health Program Director at Oregon Environmental Council. She has also worked on Capitol Hill for John Conyers Jr., Democrat from Michigan, run electoral campaigns, and managed transportation projects for the city of Portland. Sarah is also the mother of a very active 7-year-old. Welcome, Sarah. Thanks again for joining us. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks so much for the opportunity to talk with you all today. So next slide. So what I thought I would do is start with SAFER. And SAFER, as is just articulated, is a network of diverse environmental health coalitions and organizations in states around the country. And we're working to change the way we regulate chemicals in stuff, particularly utilizing state policy and the interface between state policy and market campaigning to transform what it is that's on store shelves. We're particularly active in 15 states, including Alaska. Next slide. So what does the current landscape look like? Well, as Veena was articulating, toxic and untested chemicals are everywhere in consumer products. There just isn't an effective screening process to make sure that untested chemicals are not present. At the same time, 4 billion pounds of chemicals are released by industry annually, and we know that rates of diseases linked to toxic chemicals are on the rise. So there's widespread agreement that we've got a problem. Next slide. So what's not being done? Federal law, which has sort of oversight over much of this work, the Toxic Substances Control Act, was enacted in 1976, which is a while ago. And even when it was adopted, since then, it's particularly weak in that only 5 chemicals have actually been regulated under that law. And it was not even strong enough to be able to regulate a chemical like asbestos. Only about 200 chemicals have actually been tested out of the 80,000 chemicals that are currently on the market. And so, again, we're at a point where there's recognition that the system is flawed. It hasn't kept up with current science. It's unable to be flexible to change and shift as our scientific understanding has shifted. And so now we've got change potentially happening at the federal level. But that action really may not be enough to address the true scope of the problem. Next slide. So thinking about federal reform, there are a couple of sort of key gaps to understand what's wrong with current TSCA beyond its inability to unregulate or not regulate chemicals. One is the data gap, that we're not actually, it's not like the FDA and pharmaceutical chemicals where you actually have to prove that your pharmaceutical works and it does not cause harm. The data gap, producers are not required to disclose sufficient information on the chemicals or their hazard traits so that we can identify the ones that are of concern and the ones that aren't. The safety gap is then the government, when we even can figure out what the problem is, can't then either take action to mitigate exposures. There's just the power does not exist there, which is clarified by the fact that only 5 chemicals have been regulated. And then there's just been very limited investment in safer alternatives. How do we get to where we want to go and identify the ones that cause harm and move towards ones that don't? So now we have bills that have passed. There's a version that's passed the House, and there's a version that has passed the Senate. Both versions are flawed. The Senate version is more complicated and process heavy. The House version is a little bit smaller. Both of them are industry supported. Safer Chemicals Healthy Families, which is a national coalition of over 250 organizations, is trying to weave the best of both of those. But even weaving the best of both of those, it's still a challenged dynamic. And to highlight some of those, for example, in both in the House and Senate versions, the pace of review is incredibly slow. So EPA would only be mandated to identify 5 to 10 chemicals a year to go into a process that would take up to 7 years for them to identify whether or not a chemical was of concern or not. So even if you take the 3,000 high production volume chemicals in the United States, that would take 300 years to evaluate all of those chemicals. There are provisions that make it tough to identify products that contain toxic chemicals from other countries coming into the United States and then taking them off the marketplace. Both forms include state preemption, taking away the power of the states to actually create protections. It's likely under either scenario, some flame retardants would be prioritized initially, but as was sort of highlighted, you take some off the market and then other ones show up in their place. So in the absence of federal reform, and even in the context of possible federal reform, the states have stepped up. Next page. Looking broadly, toxics policies have been adopted across the country in 33 states, over 160 over the last 12 years. Next page. They've really framed around a couple of approaches. One is disclosure, actually requiring manufacturers to disclose what chemicals are in their products. And the state of Washington created a list of 66 chemicals of concern to children and then required manufacturers who make products containing those chemicals to disclose, and that information is available publicly. Not surprisingly, that created some market transformation because we discovered that manufacturers would rather remove products from the marketplace than reveal that they contain toxic chemicals. And that I think another really interesting piece that happened from that is that as manufacturers had to report, they actually discovered what was in their products. It is a fact of today's economy that often different little pieces and parts are made by different places, and that you may not actually know what chemical constituents are in your product. So it actually forced some transparency up the supply chain. And companies actually were able to discover, or not, as the case may be, what was actually in their products. Next page. The other frame is around single chemical bans or groups of chemicals. And this is where you saw formaldehyde, lead, bisphenol A, taking it out of baby bottles and sippy cups. It really is a way to take advantage of the familiarity of a problem. One of the lessons we learned was that if you ban a chemical, an individual chemical, you have to make sure that there's some language in the policy that creates direction for wherever somebody wants to go, i.e. we were ending up, like on bisphenol A, with regrettable substitution, where they, for example, on receipt paper, it was banned, and BPA was banned on receipt paper in New York State, and all of a sudden now you have BPS, which is basically moving a molecule one slot over. So you haven't really necessarily solved the problem, you just moved it. So wanting to make sure that we're creating both regulatory incentives to go in the safer direction as well as market incentives that make it clear that there will be consumer pressure for you to go in safer directions and prove it. Next slide. So a closer look at flame retardants, and some of this is highlighted by Veena, but PBDEs were widely used in furniture and televisions, etc. And several states stepped up, including Maine, Washington, California. Ultimately, 11 states moved to ban certain forms of PBDEs, and it really created the pressure for EPA to reach an agreement with Great Lakes Chemical, which was the leading producer of the PBDE chemicals in the United States. And so that really pushed them entirely off of the U.S. marketplace. But as Veena highlighted, other ones came to take their place. And so you ended up with, again, sort of the states creating pressure on other flame retardants. We've added regrettable substitution into policy. Then you got Washington State requiring disclosure of certain flame retardants in children's products, which then created this visibility around flame retardants in nursing pillows and changing pads, which then creates the pressure on Gerber and other producers of those things to be like, wait a minute, why do we have that in our products? And then sort of in parallel, the change in the California law created it so that you could have fire-safe furniture without the use of chemical flame retardants, which interestingly also one of the problems and challenges in the children's product market was that they couldn't get foam to put in the nursing pillows and changing pads that didn't have flame retardants in it. But by shifting the market around furniture, which is a much larger market, it created more availability of flame retardant-free foam, which then could be utilized by other product sectors like the children's product sector. So there was just this sort of the beginning of a market shift. California then adopted a law requiring that flame retardant or furniture would be to be labeled either containing flame retardants or not containing flame retardants, which also creates, again, this market opportunity to create pressure for flame retardant-free furniture that is still fire safe. And then there's a new policy that was just adopted in Vermont, which will require manufacturers to disclose down to the individual product level whether that product contains flame retardants. So it will be that you can find out that the nursing pillow 1073, whether or not it contains flame retardants or not, or certain flame retardants or not. So, and at the same time, there are several states moving in a similar direction, like Alaska, like Minnesota, Rhode Island, Connecticut, to move away from named flame retardants in residential furniture and children's products to continue to create that pressure. So next slide. There are 30 adopted policies in 12 states that have really created the groundswell to date around, or part of the groundswell around flame retardants. Next slide. And as I mentioned, so the market really responded. We've got now major furniture manufacturers and retailers like Ashley, which is the #1 furniture manufacturer in the world, and others going flame retardant free. Some of them are actually currently flame retardant free. Some of them are on the path to become flame retardant free. At the same time, you've got major purchasers, particularly healthcare systems, going flame retardant free in their purchasing, creating an additional push to go flame retardant free. And I would just highlight that major mat makers are no longer using foam with toxic flame retardants. As a result of using California Prop 65 and other state policy, there was a legal strategy utilized there to sue mat manufacturers once the chemicals are listed as carcinogens on Prop 65. That became an opportunity to create a leverage point on them to make sure that they were sourcing flame retardant-free foam. So really, the core message there is that state actions really have spurred marketplace change. Next slide. So looking 2016, at least 23 states are expected to consider legislation this year. Next slide. That policy for this year includes identification and disclosure of chemicals. There are 14 states in the District of Columbia that are introducing and working on flame retardant policy. Some mirror exactly what Alaska is doing. Some are slightly different suite of chemicals. But the bottom line is this is a class of chemicals that you don't need, as Veena said, to achieve fire safety in these applications. So we should move away from them. But then you'll also see, bisphenol A, cadmium. The point being that there's this continued place in the state policy arena to create pressure on individual chemicals, as well as product sectors like residential furniture, children's products, to move them more collectively and send a signal to market leaders as well as market laggards that they need to be thinking about this in a more holistic way and getting ahead of the curve. Flame retardants may be the initial place, but they need to be thinking more about creating a comprehensive policy that allows them to avoid toxic hazards in the marketplace. So next slide. So regardless of federal reform, I did want to highlight that states are going to have a key role moving forward. Any new federal law cannot meet the challenges of 80,000 untested and unregulated chemicals all by itself. States are just well positioned to react to threats. We can create protections on chemicals that EPA hasn't gotten to, and as I articulated, may not get to for years and years and years. We're also positioned to restrict chemicals and products that are unregulated by the Toxic Substances Control Act, such as cosmetics and food packaging. We can require information, this disclosure, this piece that creates market transparency that allows consumers to choose that isn't really going to be robustly fulfilled by any of the proposed TSCA reform. And we can speed the pace of creating important restrictions. You know, as I said, I believe some of the flame retardants are likely to be prioritized, but other ones may not. And states introducing and moving policies helps create pressure on the Environmental Protection Agency to move on those chemicals. So next slide. So the states really do have and have had and will continue to have a key role in both the regulatory context and the market context of building the space and creating the pressures that change what is on store shelves and making them safer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Before we move on to our questions and answer period, I'd like to invite Alaska Community Action on Toxics Executive Director Pam Miller to give us an update on Alaska's Toxic-Free Children's Act. She and another one of our staff and several of our activists are down in Juneau as we speak, and so this is hot off the press. Pam.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you to Veena and Sarah for your great presentations. So as Patty said, a group of us are here in our state capitol in rainy Juneau, so good morning from rainy Juneau. We're here speaking with our legislators to advocate for our flame retardant bill, which is the Toxic-Free Children's Act. For Alaskans, that's Senate Bill 111 and House Bill 199. And this is a bill that was introduced last April by Senator Bill Wielechowski on the Senate side and Representative Drummond on the House side. And it would ban 10 flame retardant chemicals that are used in children's products and furniture and also require labeling. So it's very important legislation, and we think that we have some good bipartisan support. The bill has had one hearing in the Senate Labor and Commerce Committee in late January, so very early on in the session, which was a good thing. And we saw a huge presence of the chemical industry. So the Chemical Industry Association, known as the American Chemistry Council, sent representatives. We had another industry association and also the Alaska Chamber of Commerce turned up at the hearing to speak out against the bill. And we had a lot of Alaskans and a lot of Alaskans lined up to testify. And we heard from the Learning Disabilities Association in support of the bill, and also the American Sustainable Business Council. And then the chair of the committee, Senator Mia Costello, shut the committee hearing down. So our most important thing right now is to ensure that we have a second hearing in the Senate Labor and Commerce Committee. So we're asking everybody to contact the chair, Senator Mia Costello, to urge her to hold a second hearing, because there are many Alaskans that want to speak out in support of this bill. We have great support from groups such as the Alaska Nurses Association, the Alaska Association of Professional Firefighters, Fire Chiefs, the Alaska Federation of Natives, ARC of Anchorage. Several villages have sent in letters of support and resolutions, fishing organizations. So there's a lot of support from individuals and organizations around Alaska who feel that this is a very critical and important public health issue, that it is quite urgent for all of the reasons that that Veena spoke of, because these chemicals are associated with learning and developmental disabilities as well as cancer. So there's some real urgency here, and we have an opportunity to protect the health of Alaskans, and especially the most vulnerable among us, children, as well as firefighters, our families and communities. So with that, I think I'll stop, and so that we have time for questions. And if you'd like more information, we have fact sheets, also an action alert so that you can contact your legislators on our website at akaction.org. So we just urge all of you to please contact your legislators, contact the chair of the Senate Labor and Commerce Committee, Mia Costello, to urge her to hold the second hearing, because this bill can't get moving again unless it passes out of the Senate Labor and Commerce Committee. So that's the most urgent thing that we're asking you to do. So thanks, everyone. Good to talk with you.
All right, well, thank you, Pam. I'd like to thank all our presenters and all of you for calling in. We have 39 people on the line. So we'd like to invite you to ask your questions and comments for our speakers. So if you have a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. State your name and affiliation, and please be brief so we can get in as many questions as possible. Please, when you're done asking your question, press *2 again to remute your line so that we don't hear background noises. So do we have any questions?
Oh, this is Dr. Roy Ozan from Two Rivers, Wisconsin. And I am wondering if instead of the one chemical at a time, are there efforts to try and encourage our manufacturers to stop using petrochemicals altogether, or at least really minimize it, because that seems to be where most of the bad players come from. Thank you.
Well, this is Sarah. There are increasing efforts to take on classes of chemicals like organohalogens, flame retardants, or chemicals that are like perfluorinated compounds, antimicrobials, less around the petrochemical frame writ large, just because I think probably because there's a power dynamic there, and if you say get rid of all, petroleum-based products, politically that would be extremely difficult, versus this is a class of chemicals that have similar properties and characteristics. At the same time, as we are talking with our manufacturing and corporate allies, we're talking about it more in terms of hazard endpoints. Does it cause cancer? Is it neurodevelopmental toxin, et cetera? And entire classes of chemicals will meet those standards, and so that's just another way to get at having us collectively think about how we regulate chemicals differently in a broader way.
And this is Veena. I just add to that that it's really important to think about the question: is it necessary when there's a chemical of concern used in a product? And that's something that we emphasize in our conversations with manufacturers and in policy, that if the chemical is not needed, like these flame retardants in furniture and kids products, then the best solution is simply to remove the chemical altogether and not worry about the substitute or alternative.
Right. It still just seems to me that until we do take the petrochemical-wide issue, we still will be just chasing chemical after chemical for the next 50 years.
This is Veena again. I'll say I think the speaker is right to identify the important connection between the oil and gas industry and many of these toxic chemicals. As Sarah noted, it's a real challenge and we're moving forward on many fronts as we can, and I think it is a central challenge, and we're attempting to address the problem by taking steps to reduce exposures and remove toxic chemicals now as we can.
Hi, this is Patty from Anchorage. I'm wondering if the new or about to be new incentives against using carbon-based fuel may have some impact on the petrochemicals that are available as a byproduct of fuel production. And as we move away from carbon-based fuel, that we may have less of the byproducts available for the chemical industry to use as feedstock.
Well, that certainly seems reasonable. I don't know enough about that particular frame. I mean, like, that certainly is a source. I think the piece, though, that's really interesting is thinking about what are the other feedstocks for chemicals. And as that was sort of that third gap that I identified, the technology gap in the investment in green chemistry, are there other chemistries or other kinds of feedstocks that, if we can help them become more viable, more competitive, more valuable, that then creates a natural sort of market incentive away from the petrochemicals. It's just sort of another piece of, in addition to sort of the regulatory, don't do that, and the market consumer, like, oh, I want that safer thing, then also sort of the economic side of, is there a greener chemistry that also uses a greener feedstock that we can create incentives around.
Hello, my name is Arlene Feingold, and I'm an industrial hygienist, and more important, I'm a grandmother, a caring grandmother. What I was wondering about is, well, I live in California, and luckily we've passed some legislation which looks good for the future. But many families already have an existence. They have their couches. You know, smaller articles are not hard to replace, but large articles like couches and furniture poses a financial problem for replacing. So do you think that by covering these, covering furniture, would that help at all, putting a cover on? Or if it's older, would it be less toxic if it's, say, 20 years old or something? That would be my question.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. As far as we know, putting a cover over the couch probably doesn't reduce the migration of these chemicals out very much. One thing I would note is that another option, as opposed to trying to replace the whole couch, is to replace the foam inside the cushions, which is where 80 to 100% typically of the flame retardants are. If you just replace the foam inside the cushions with flame retardant-free foam, that is another option instead of replacing the whole couch, and that's typically much more economical. And I would also note that there's some simple, easy ways to reduce your and your family's exposure to flame retardants. One is just frequently washing your hands, and always before eating. So that is shown to reduce flame retardant exposures, because there's a lot of that exposure that comes through the contaminated dust on kids' hands. So just make sure to have them wash their hands frequently and before they eat. That's a good way to reduce exposures to the flame retardants, and try to keep dust down in the house by wet mopping and vacuuming with the HEPA filter.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Darryl McQueen. I'm calling from My Pie. I have a quick question. I'm out in New Jersey. Sarah, you did a phenomenal job explaining the pathways of the flame retardants getting into humans. But one of the things I wanted to know is there a way to not just reduce it from the furniture side of things, but is there a way to reduce what has already been contaminated within our bodies?
That's a good question. What we know is that it seems like if we remove the sources of the exposure, that the levels inside our bodies appear to go down. So what we've seen since the PDDE bans and phase outs that Sarah mentioned is that the PBDE levels in people are now decreasing. So, I showed that graph showing the levels increasing over time, and now what we're seeing is that the levels are going down as the chemicals were removed from commerce and the products are exiting our homes. So that removing the source seems to be the best way to reduce our exposure.
All right. Well, I think we're getting close to 10 o'clock, so I think I'll stop the questions now. As a reminder, we do record these calls. We have more than 100 audio recordings of past calls at the ACAT website at www.akaction.org. We'll notify you when we have posted the MP3 recording of this call onto our website. If you have additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact us. The phone number is 907-222-7714. Email, you can contact me at Patty, P-A-T-T-I, at akaction.org. And if I can't answer your question, I'll make sure it's forwarded to one of the speakers so they can get back to you. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.